Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu, he is Stefan Bienkowski. This is on a Sunday. Bundesliga matchday literally just wrapped up as we record this. Lots of things to chat about. We're going to talk about the Klassiker, obviously. We're going to talk about Leverkusen. We're going to touch on Frankfurt and their big game, upcoming game against Tottenham. So lots to chat about. But before we do all of that, Stefan, how's it going? How's your weekend been? Are you ready to go back to work tomorrow?
Is anyone ever really ready to go back to work?
I'm sure not.
Well, that's because you had an actual holiday. I've had 2 weeks off and it's been anything but a holiday. No, yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to kind of get back to some sort of structure of knowing what day it is, what time of day it is, all those things. The last 2 weeks have just been an absolute blur with the newborn. So yeah, it'll be nice to kind of try and get back some form of normality. But when I log in and have like 400 messages to respond to, I'll probably quickly change my mind.
What's that meme where like this Japanese anime character gets washed away by a wave and it's all replaced with emails?
Yeah. It's Spirited Away, I think it is, yeah.
This is why like I sneakily log into work once a day and just clean those all out. Just check and take mental notes of what to take care of, because otherwise it's 5,000 messages and 500 emails when you get back. Yeah, no. And I also I think it's curious that you think there's going to be some sort of structure in your life just because you're going back to work, Stefan.
Well, not the structure in that sense, but just structure in the sense that I know what time I'm supposed to wake up at and what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm like, oh, right, is that 5 p.m.? Okay, I better try and eat something then or something,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a bit wild, but yeah, that'll be good. It'll be good. I'm looking forward to it. I mean, we'll find out. I mean, by the time listeners can listen into the previous show on Friday and see what kind of mood I'm in, and they'll know what kind of week I've had.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can't wait to because I always log on when our work day always overlaps a couple hours at Transfermarkt, and I always log on when it's towards the end of your day, and I'm curious to see what mood you are gonna be in once I log into work in the morning. We'll see how that goes. Okay, let's move into the Bundesliga though. Let's chat about work tomorrow and focus on this. Bayern 2, Dortmund 2. I sort of sense at the end of the day, this was a result that neither club was really happy with, Stefan. I had the sense that there was quite a bit of frustration on both sides. We get into Leverkusen and their season in a moment, but obviously this point helps Bayern more than it does Dortmund. I think for Dortmund, the hope that they could maybe catch up with and get a Champions League spot, I think it gets somewhat buried. It's a 6-point swing now in 5 games. That's a big ask, considering 2 was in between them. And Leipzig with a good result this weekend, right? Frankfurt are probably out of reach now. We get to talk about Frankfurt towards the end of the podcast. They're probably out of reach now, really. So it's really only one Champions League spot left that they could feasibly reach. And I just think that 1 point for them is a huge disappointment. Bayern, I think, were there for the taking. I think there was an opportunity there for Dortmund to do what they did last year and win at the Allianz Arena. And then I think any other day and in any other season, this is probably a result that they would celebrate. Yet I had the sense that they were really heavily disappointed. Really comes down to that Pascal Groß chance, doesn't it? The one after Anton made it 2-2 where he breaks through and lobs the ball over Urbik and that doesn't go in. But it also, the fact that they conceded 2 really quick goals after going up 1-0 with a wonderful Bayer header. Guerrero and Gnabry scoring within 4 minutes, 65th and 69th. And the Gnabry goal in particular, I mean, that was like slaloms. That was like downhill ski slalom through Dortmund's defense. It was so easy, right? And those are just the moments that really
it's a very Bavarian
Dortmund.
Metaphor there for our worldwide listeners.
Well, it's a Bavarian team.
He dribbled like a skier through the Bavarian Alps.
Yeah, no, if there's any snow left these days in the Bavarian Alps, I think that's the other question. But, it just, that goal in particular seemed very easy. very, very easy. And that's too often the case. But yeah, I think, starting with Dortmund, this is just 2 points dropped that I think is going to really, really hurt them.
Yeah, it was such an odd game. We spent the whole week kind of talking about the fact that nobody was really talking about this match. We did our preview show talking about how it's ranting rather about how it's not that they're Klassiker. The Klassiker is this kind of myth. And
I need to intersect you here. And then the DFL taunted us by putting it on the advertising board, saying it's always the Klassiker.
Oh God, yeah. I mean,
I know who's responsible for this. I know who you are.
I said this during the game as well on social media about how many times the commentators were cramming it in. And look, we know a lot of the guys do the commentary for the DFL games, and they're all very, very good. They're all very professional. Yeah. They're all excellent at their jobs. And I know that they're probably getting this from the bosses to kind of keep cramming it in, and it's on the billboards, as you said, it's in the newsletters, it's plastered across everything. But I think it was a game that once it kicked off, we realised very quickly that these were two very tired, very injury ravaged, exhausted football teams, and neither of them really wanted this game to take place. Both of them obviously had very grueling Champions League games in midweek. Both still got Champions League games to go. Obviously, Dortmund are more or less out of the Champions League unless some sort of miracle happens. Bayern's still in for a shout against Inter Milan. But so Bayern had that to contend with, but also Dortmund have to contend with, as you said, their kind of hopes of maybe trying to get back into top four before the end of the season. But for one reason or another, both these teams just really struggled to actually kind of win this game. I thought in the first half, Bayern kind of exerted their control in the game. It was a match in which they had a handful of chances in the first half. And we went in at half time, kind of saying to our subscribers in the live chat that we have every match day that, it was amazing that it was still 0-0. And we just assumed that Bayern would kind of sleepwalk to a pretty comfortable win there. And then all of a sudden, boom, Kim drops a clanger and lets Maximilian Bayer head home at the back post, relatively unopposed. And you thought, oh, right, maybe we have a bit of an upset here. But then, equally, Bayern bring on Serge Gnabry, who's obviously been out injured, who's been on the bench, who's probably a lot fitter and having played far fewer games than a lot of the players on this pitch. And within 10 minutes, he just ran through that Bayern defence. The Dortmund defence, as if they weren't there, especially the second goal where Emre Can and Niklas Süle just kind of watched them drift by them. It was kind of classic kind of Serge Gnabry, perfect substitute appearance from him to kind of turn the game in their favour. And then in the last minute, but 15 minutes before full time, I thought some truly outstanding skill from Sergio Guirassy to kind of for anyone who's missed, it's worth watching the highlights of all these goals. Actually, they're all good goals, but his was wonderful, where he's kind of fighting off the marking of, I'm not actually sure who it was. I think Eric Dyer he was up against. Wonderful kind of bit of skill as he's kind of falling back to kind of get a scissor kick off, and then obviously Anton kind of taps it home. So it felt to me like a game where kind of individual brilliance kind of stood out against two teams who just didn't really have the cohesion or the players or the stamina to kind of dominate this match. And I guess in a sense, a draw was probably quite fair. But as you said, it doesn't really suit anyone. It probably suits Bayern slightly more because of what happened in the Leverkusen game, which we'll come to. I don't know if it was Thomas Müller or Vincent Kompany after the match saying, a point's probably fair. We probably shouldn't be too bothered about that. And I thought, there's no way they'd be saying this if Leverkusen had won their game. A draw against Dortmund in this match would have been seen as a disaster, I think, if Leverkusen had won that match. But, fate should have it that they were able to kind of take a bit of a breather and accept 2 points dropped. But as you said, Dortmund are still kind of wanting for European football, and the chase for the top four. And I don't know, it felt to me, Manu, like a game where both teams kind of disappointed. I'm trying not to be too much of a downer on this one, but it just felt like a match where we didn't really see the best of either of these sides because, for the most part, they were both playing their B teams.
Yeah, that's how I felt about it. I wrote that the Klassiker wasn't really a classic. I think it was entertaining because we had 4 goals, but the level. I mean, I remember clashes between those two sides, even in more recent memory, even including the one last year that Dortmund won. Right, that the level was just way higher, and. It just feels like I mean, this it's not just Bayern and Dortmund. There's a lot of Bundesliga teams that are literally limping to the finish line, and I think this is a result of the many games and probably also the fact that Germany, with the Euros and a lot of I think the Bundesliga clubs were the most represented at the Euros, especially in the later stages of the competition, right? And I think that is an impact, and we've discussed in the past that Bundesliga squads aren't as deep as they are in England or Spain or Italy, and there's always a very conservative approach towards building squads and not necessarily having redundancies is something that Bundesliga clubs don't necessarily like because it's something that they can't plan for. Which is why Bayern, for example, only have one backup number 10, and that's Thomas Müller, and we can talk about him maybe in a moment. And this is the same is true for Dortmund. The squad depth looks very thin at the moment, especially in defense, where I think they don't have the strength to really fight on all fronts. I said jokingly in the chat that with both these teams being in the Club World Cup, come August, neither club might have any players left to be able to play. I mean, this is just a continuation right away, right? Like it's not like, oh, the season ends and these guys will all have a rest. That's not even happening here, right? A whole bunch of them will play the UEFA Nations League Final Four, and then Bayern and Dortmund are headed to the United States. And I mean, we're getting to the point now where Dortmund are thinking of signing Mats Hummels for the tournament, and Bayern extended the contract with Thomas Müller. And some of it is, I think, is just due to the fact that they need these guys to fill up the squad. But my point being is that you can see in this match that these teams are tired, and for Dortmund, the season in Europe will be over on Wednesday. Oh, sorry, on Tuesday. For Bayern, they will try to somehow survive in the Champions League. I'm slightly optimistic that they maybe can get a result in Italy. It's going to be hard, of course, but I think they could do it. But then what, right? Where are they going to find the strength to continue on in that competition after that? Is really questionable. And I think we're getting to the point now where you showcase events in the big leagues are no longer showcase events because these clubs are just exhausted. And I think that is something too. I mean, we had this discussion about the level of play in this game and the squad depth and the way squads were put together. Thomas Müller playing the full 90 minutes. I personally thought he had his moments, but there was times where you could just tell that the game is too fast for him now, right? And but what else is poor Vincent Kompany supposed to do? He has to play the 35-year-old number 10 because there's no one else in the squad. And yeah, I think that's where like you look at all of these things and I felt like the game was unsatisfactory is maybe the best way to put it. And I sum it all up, it just, you used to have this really like satisfying feeling after games that were close between those two teams where I'm like, yeah, that was really good and I wish it would go on for another 10, 15 minutes. Whereas with this one, it was over and I almost felt relief for the players that were on the field that they finally got to get a rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Thomas Müller one's really interesting because it shows Bayern's kind of necessity at this point. They just don't have anyone they could put in there. I did kind of walk away from this game kind of wondering about Vincent Kompany and his coaching of Bayern this season. And in the first half of the season, we gave him a lot of credit for the way they sorted out that defence and the way that he had Upamecano and Kim playing so well, and Davies was looking back to his best. They were kind of jokingly saying, "Oh, he's playing for a contract," but he was still playing very well for the first time in like 2 or 3 years. Yeah. He'd done a decent job of continuing with Konrad Laimer at right back, who's doing okay there, and it kind of looked like Bayern kind of had their house in order defensively. and they were scoring goals up front. I mean, it was more or less, wait and see till Musiala does something. Hopefully Harry Kane can tap the ball in. But it worked because defensively they were solid and they were still scoring goals, so they were winning games. We've got to this point now at this stage of the season where that defence has fallen apart because literally everybody's injured. Manuel Neuer's out, Upamecano's out, Davies is out. So you've only really got one player in Kim who's probably a starter in that back line. And even he's carrying an injury. He looks exhausted. I thought he obviously had a terrible game and got pulled off in this match because of the manner in which he obviously gave away the first goal. But then that also kind of highlights not only the defensive issues, which you could understandably say, well, there's only so much that Bayern and Vincent Kompany can do because, he's missing his key players. He's having to play backups here, there, and everywhere. But then if you look at the attack, we've talked about this for a couple of weeks now, Bayern do more or less have their full-strength front line, except for Jamal Musiala there. And I'm really intrigued by the lack of imagination that Kompany is showing in trying to solve the problems to that attacking lineup. Musiala missing is obviously a huge problem for them. But as far as I can tell, the only kind of real decisions that Kompany's done to try and fix that is to play Guerrero in there against Inter Milan, which kind of worked, but I don't think it was terribly good. And then in this game, he obviously brought in Thomas Muller, who I thought was okay. He was good as a kind of almost a target man. He has there was two moments for he obviously set up Guerrero for his goal, but he also kind of set up Harry Kane for a shot in the first half, I think it was. And he's still got that technique where he can lay a ball off to somebody if they swing it into him in the box, but. I was chatting to our subscribers about this. I was like, I don't understand why he's so reticent to play Michael Olise at number 10 or Leroy Sané at number 10 or, because we're talking about the way that Serge Gnabry's kind of came into his game the last kind of couple of weeks and how he's looking back to his best. Now, Gnabry is an interesting one and he can sometimes kind of flat deceive because I think he does suit being an impact sub at times rather than a kind of starter. But you would think looking ahead to the Inter Milan game, Kompany would be really thinking, I should try and shuffle the pack here with his front line. I should be trying Gnabry out left. I should be trying Olise in the middle. I should be trying Leroy Sané out right. Things aren't working. I need to shake things up. And he just doesn't really seem too interested in doing that. And I just kind of wonder if that just falls back on his background as a player. He obviously knows how to set up defences, but in the grand scheme of things, he's not very imaginative from an attacking point of view. And I think that kind of cost Bayern a wee bit in this game, in the sense that, they just looked very predictable. And I think it cost them quite a lot in the Inter Milan game, to be honest with you. I know Guerrero scores in this game, so can't be critical of him too much. I know Thomas Muller got an assist, so you don't want to be too critical either. But I just kind of have this lingering fear that they're just going to set up in a very predictable way against Inter Milan, and it's not going to cause too many problems. And interestingly enough, in both of these games, Harry Kane, I think, and I don't want to keep going back to this because I don't want to start building up a reputation for being a Harry Kane hater, but in both of these games, Kane had chances, but you just fluffed the lines numerous times. He had 4 shots on target in this game against Dortmund. He had 2 shots on target against Inter Milan, not including that absolute whiffed volley that he had, which he should have scored. 6 attempts on goal in both these matches, so 6 each, so 12 in total. And no goals, and an XG of just 1.3, of course, across both games. And it feels to me like maybe just because Musiala's missing, but also because this front line is just so regimented and not showing too much creativity that Kane's just not been anywhere near good enough in both these games, and that's kind of indicative of this entire front line right now.
Well, I mean, I think you're quite right? That the creative aspect in attack has been an issue. And I mean, we discussed that earlier this season, that sometimes they just would score 1 or 2 goals, or they would finally score a second goal. The Augsburg game comes to mind, right, from a penalty, and then add a third in the end, and the result looks a lot better than it actually was. There's a few games where Musiala would score a single goal, the St. Pauli game, for example, right? The game against Lisbon as well. And you would kind of wonder, okay, well, that's not a lot of attacking output here, right? The goals usually come when the game is decided, not before that, and it would be a lot of huffing and puffing. And defensively, yeah, they were very sound. I mean, Kompany made this point after the Dortmund game that his team over the last 2 games, and so the Dortmund Inter Milan game, they had 50 shots on goal, or almost 50 shots on goal. He said it was actually 48, but then when you break that down, it's actually just 7 shots on goal, right? So in hockey, if you're a hockey fan, they actually only count shots on goal. They don't count a shot that goes towards the goal, and they actually also only count shots on goal that the goalie had to save. So if it's a post or crossbar, they don't even count those. And I think we should probably do the same here, because if it's some shot from 30 meters out over the crossbar, is that really a shot on goal? In my opinion, it's not. I think it should be a shot on target, right?
Yeah.
And when you then break that down to just 7, that number is a lot less than 48, and actually, in the grand scheme of things, not great, Stefan. And actually kind of highlights that, yeah, there's a lot of opportunities and moments where Bayern Munich look dangerous, but they don't actually create really big chances.
Yeah, and it's going to be a huge problem for them in this Inter Milan game, who Inter Milan are experts at playing defensive football. And I don't know, I just feel like the whole kind of system for Bayern now is kind of crumbling because they rely so much on that decent backline, and it's kind of falling apart. And they just don't really have a coherent, multi-pronged attack that can kind of compensate for it. It's not like they're a team right now who are just outscoring their defense right at this moment in time. They are kind of faltering, and I guess we'll just have to kind of wait and see what happens. The proof will be in the pudding. They might go on and beat Inter Milan. They might put in a heroic performance, and then Leroy Sané or Serge Gnabry score a hat trick, and it's like, well, do you know what? Everything's fine. But where Kompany has clearly improved a number of those defensive players in that squad, I am probably struggling to think of any attacking players in that team who've actually excelled, except for Michael Olise, who was potentially always that good. He was always going to do that well, so it's hard to... I don't want to take away from Kompany, but if you look through that front line, has Harry Kane got any better this season? No. Has Leroy Sané got any better this season? No. Has Jamal Musiala got any better this season? I would say he's probably not. He's probably just doing as well as last season, if not a slightly poorer in terms of his actual numbers. I know he's got injured, so that's not his fault. And Matthijs Tel was punted out the door in January. So, it's an interesting thing to maybe bear in mind as we kind of get to this really, really tricky stage of the season, how Kompany addresses these problems in front of him, and if he has answers to them.
So, it's a really good point. I think, it's something that we have to discuss, and I think that they will have to reshuffle that attacking line in the summer. With Müller gone, right, there's going to be resources and space available. I think, and this is maybe worth for doing an extra show on at some point, but the pursuit of Florian Wirtz, why, Wirtz would probably fix a lot of the problems in this team, I think would be just as dangerous as going just after Harry Kane, right? Because what if both Wirtz and Musiala are hurt? Then this team is very toothless, and I think you'd probably be better off taking the 140, 150 million euros that it takes to sign Florian Wirtz and focus on getting more Michael Olise into the squad. But not more players like him, but players that you can pick up for that sort of price category and turn into a superstar. Michael Olise has been immense. What a signing he has been. He's just incredible, and it's probably what's rescuing Max Eberl's job at the moment, considering some of the other signings that have not really worked out. Find more players like that. I think you're a lot better off. I did some digging into this Luis Enrique guy that they're looking at Olympique Marseille. It looks like a really good player that they can probably get for 20, 30 million euros. Will probably fill the Kingsley Coman role quite nicely, increases market value. That's the sort of signing where I'm thinking that actually could work. And I think that is probably a better focus for them. And so rather than this pursuit of a single player, that could end them in a similar situation than now with Harry Kane, I think is quite dangerous. And I think too, for Harry Kane, before we go to Leverkusen, this game on Wednesday against Inter Milan could be defining for his career at Bayern Munich. This is the game that he was signed for, to get the goals out of the fire, to score the decisive goals. That that on Wednesday could be his career in a nutshell, positive or negative for Bayern Munich, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, as one of his subscribers said during the Inter Milan game where he misses that volley, like that's exactly why Bayern signed him for 100, 120 million euros to score that goal. And look, it's not just something about Harry Kane. It's something that it's a criticism that was often thrown at Robert Lewandowski
Yep.
at this stage of the Champions League. You have to be the guy who scores those chances. These strikers do not get the same amount of chances in these Champions League games as they're used to in the Bundesliga. So that's when they have to prove that they can be as efficient in front of goal and take the few chances that they get. And yeah, we'll have to wait and see what happens. You know, like I said, you know, Harry Kane could score against Inter Milan. He could score a brace, and then all of a sudden he turns the game back in their favour. But you're right, all eyes will be on him and see what he can do, because it's all well and good, you know, things working for him when he's got penalties to score and he's got Joao Musiala running off him, and you know, potentially, undoubtedly one of the best kind of number 10s in the world. But it's all very different when that guy gets injured and he's relying on 2 or 3 out of form players. You know, where it's Leroy Sané or whoever else, or Thomas Müller behind him, or Rafa Guerrero as his number 10. That's when he has to kind of really prove that he can actually step up and be more, and be a match winner, and be a player who can actually create chances for Bayern. And that's exactly what they're going to need against Inter Milan. But we didn't see it in the first leg, and I don't think we saw much of it against Dortmund either.
No, we didn't. We absolutely didn't. But thankfully for Bayern Munich, it's probably going to be enough, because Bayer Leverkusen 0-0 against Union Berlin. There was a moment there at the very end, I think, that summed it up really well. Granit Xhaka with a free kick, season-defining free kick from just the left of the goalkeeper from outside the box. And rather than bringing it into the box where maybe someone could head it in, he fires it over the crossbar, and the game ends, and everyone looks on disappointed, probably expecting Bayern Munich to win their game against Dortmund. They didn't, so the gap remains at 6 points, 5 games left. It really is a 7-point swing though, Stefan, because Bayern have a way better goal differential. Just to put this into perspective, in the 5 remaining games, Bayern Munich have to drop points in 3 of them. That is the task at hand that Leverkusen face, while they have to win every single one. Now, I do think that Leverkusen could win the remaining 5 games. I do think that's actually possible, especially because they're not in Europe anymore. They finally have time to train. They can sit back and relax while Bayern Munich potentially get past Inter Milan. Even if Bayern Munich don't get past Inter Milan, you know, they still have to exert themselves. Bayern Munich's defensive issues seem to get worse, not better. So, you know, there is that. There is probably, I think it's possible that they dwindle down those points even further. But I think they're just going to run out of runway here. So we have to start thinking thinking about how Leverkusen seasons, how are we going to judge them at the end of this year, because I think it's going to be a titleless year, considering where they were this year. Remember, they're out in the Pokal. They lost to Arminia Bielefeld side, who are now counting the Euros and already hoping and looking forward to Europa League participation, you know, which is pretty funny. But it is a difficult story now, I think, for Leverkusen. I think you actually got some pushback saying it wasn't a great year. I would agree with your social media post, because, you know, the game today, the result against Werder Bremen when Bayern Munich dropped points, the 0-0 draw at the Bayer Arena. I have no problem that they only drew Bayern in Munich. That's fine. But that 0-0 draw at the Bayer Arena, where I think they were way better than Bayern Munich, those 3 results right there, that is the title. That puts them ahead of Bayern Munich, right? And then, of course, there's the Champions League, I think, where Alonso was completely outcoached. That was a disaster over 180 minutes. It put Leverkusen back in their place. So, yeah, I would say it's a pretty disappointing year for them.
Yeah, exactly. I did post on social media after the draw with Union Berlin, and this was obviously before we realised that Bayern were going to drop points as well. But I said, you know, Bayern or Leverkusen season ends in a whimper, and that's how I saw it. You know, They have struggled to create chances in the last two games. Last two games in particular, the previous match day as well against Heidenheim, which they should have lost, to be perfectly honest with you. Um, they almost lost this game. Lucas Herdesky was up to his old tricks again, where in the first half he goes to save a free kick by just kind of punching it
Yeah.
into, I can't remember who the player was for Union Berlin, but he was extremely fortunate that the player was ruled offside because it was an absolute howler from Herdecki. And I think that in a way kind of does sum up what's gone wrong at Leverkusen so far this season. They had this kind of crack team of specialists last season that all kind of managed to put in a shift, all play to the very best of their ability. And Xabi Alonso was able to rely on them for the duration of the season to do something superhuman, to do something that no Leverkusen team's obviously ever done. And the plan was in the summer to obviously go and find a replacement to a number of these players and refresh the team, bring in new players, fresh blood, and make a fresh start at defending their title with new players, new options, and that hasn't happened. I'd say just about every single signing that Leverkusen's made this season has been a flop, except maybe Alex Garcia. I think he'll probably turn into a decent player, but it's taken him 3/4 of the season to start putting in decent performances. And even at that, he was signed to take the load off Granit Xhaka. And as I wrote my newsletter last week, detailing Xhaka's kind of fall from grace, Xabi Alonso still hasn't dropped him. He hasn't been rested for a single Bundesliga game this season. So yes, Alex Garcia's done all right. Palacios has looked decent at times. But these players have never been allowed to step in for Xabi Alonso. And that was a primary goal brought into this team. Martin Terrier has been absolutely useless, just as injury prone as he was before. Mukiele, I think, has sabotaged that Bayern backline more than helped it. Hermoso's not been up to much. Belaquin, young player, so I'll give him the benefit of the doubt there, obviously. But almost man for man, these players have not stepped up. And crucially, they haven't been able to help Leverkusen by stepping in for the players who needed a rest after a really tough run last season. And, it's why this Leverkusen team have really kind of came to the end of their tether. And just kind of, as I said, the season has been defined by these kind of points dropped. I know they obviously beat Heidenheim, but it came to a last-minute goal, really. And then Union Berlin was no much better. And I wouldn't be surprised if they go to St. Pauli this weekend and drop points there as well, to be honest with you. I know Wirtz is back. That might change things, but even still, this team looks exhausted. And yeah, I had some pushback from people being like, "What are you talking about? They're still second. They're still on course to have their second best ever points tally in the Bundesliga," and that's all very fair. And yes, in the grand scheme of Leverkusen's history, they are doing tremendously well. But there's nobody at that club who thinks that team are performing as well as they should be, let alone Xabi Alonso, who obviously sets huge standards there. And I would honestly go so far as to say, after this season, there may actually be some question marks over Xabi Alonso as a head coach, in my opinion. And I know that's a really kind of hot take, but last season, everything worked out perfectly for him. He had his system in place, the players played tremendously well to it, and he had a world-class player in Florian Wirtz who basically pulled them out of the fire numerous times. They were called Neverkusen, or they went from being called Neverkusen to Laterkusen or whatever it was we used to call them, because they kept winning all these.
Or never losing.
Never losing, yeah,
or late, yeah, all these other ones, yeah,
exactly. They went. So he had a system that everyone worked tremendously well in. Obviously, a number of players who played out their skin who had never shown it before. Herdecki, Jonathan Tah, guys like that, and then he had Florian Wirtz, who was like, the closest thing that the Bundesliga's had to Lionel Messi. I'll go so far as to say that, aside for maybe Jamal Musiala. He had everything lined up for him. This season, that all fell apart. But instead of having creative solutions to those problems, Xabi Alonso has just stubbornly stuck with the exact same team every week. Yeah, he's made some changes. He's put a Mukiele in here, or a Palacios in there, or let's try Robert Andrik at right back, or centre back, or let's try Frimpong as a striker. He's kind of played around with those things. But for the most part, he hasn't really been willing to change his tactics or his system, even though that squad is obviously looking exhausted. And I do kind of wonder if, everyone keeps saying, oh, and it's this constant speculation over, oh, will Xabi Alonso go to Real Madrid? Has he been tempted by Real Madrid? How can Real Madrid tempt Xabi Alonso to go there? I just kind of wonder if I was a Real Madrid fan so obviously watching their season go up in smoke, and understandably is probably grasping at straws, thinking, well, hopefully we can get someone like Xabi Alonso to come in and fix things. I just kind of wonder if Xabi Alonso's had one good season at Leverkusen. Okay, maybe two, because he obviously did a decent job the first season, first half season, whatever it was. But in this season, everything went wrong for Leverkusen, and he hasn't really struck me as a head coach who's had a clear answer to these problems. He hasn't got the most of the signings they've brought in. Now, that might just be because they're all flops, or it could just be that he's not really been willing to change his system to adapt to the players that they've signed. And I just kind of wonder if, I don't know, he maybe feel like he has a point to prove, and that might be why he stays at Leverkusen. But and maybe I'm being incredibly harsh here, but if he stays at Leverkusen this summer, I'd be looking at the team and thinking, I actually think Xabi Alonso has a bit of a point to prove in that third season. Yeah. He has to sit down and be like, no, I can not say that he has to win the Bundesliga, but he has to make that team. It's almost like that band that have the amazing first album, and then they then have all this pressure to, put the lighting back in the bottle and redo it again. That's kind of where Xabi Alonso is with this Leverkusen team right now. He won the Bundesliga, and now I feel like he's really struggling to show that he can repeat that miracle. And we'll have to wait and see what he can do next season, because it hasn't worked out for them this season.
I actually think there's an argument to be made that this could turn out to be a good season for Leverkusen if they win next year. Like, if this is their second biggest point total in history, behind Bayern Munich, and they draw the right conclusions from this season to realize what it takes. And they actually, if next year they go back in it and they win the Bundesliga back, and then you can say, like, okay, well, then over the 3-year period, this was a really good 3 years, right? Including the season that is this. In a vacuum, when you only take this season, it's, of course, a huge disappointment because it's a huge drop from last year. I think what really is going to be interesting to see is what's going to happen next. These Bayern Munich, of course, pushing for Florian Wirtz. I personally think the Bundesliga can shut its doors if they sign Florian Wirtz. I think it would be over. It would end that league. What's the point even at that stage anymore, right? So I really hope that doesn't happen. But I think also, the conclusions that have to come now, and this includes, at the end of the day, Xabi Alonso isn't the only one who's signing players. He had Simon Rolfe's job too, right? And he made all the right decisions the summer before last. He has to show now that he can make the right decisions again. They need a new goalkeeper. They need to replace Jonathan Tah. They need to, find a player who can play like Hoffmann, because Hoffmann really dropped off this year, right? We talk a lot about Thomas Müller and the performances, and when players in their mid-30s drop off a cliff, how quick it can go. Hoffmann is another example here. They need to find his lack of productivity is, I think, something that's really hurting them, because they didn't go out to find a replacement for him. And I think that is something that is hurting them quite a bit. So they need to draw the right conclusions here. I know in the goalkeeper position, I hear names like Ortega. There's that guy from Espanyol, right? Garcia. These are all good names, and I think would be a huge upgrade. And I think it would help the team. And it's help that it's really needed. I think they need to find a solution with the attack of Boniface and Schick. Do you sell one of them to bring in more creative attacking players? Those are all decisions that they need to be made in the summer. And Stefan, I think the sense of optimism, maybe if Wirtz and Alonso stay, I think they have a really good shot next year, because Dortmund and Bayern Munich are playing this tournament in America, a full 7 games potentially for them, right? Because I do think you can go very deep very quickly, because the group stage is quite easy for European teams, and then who knows who you get. So you have at least 4 or 5 games, maybe all 7, to navigate there in different time zone and hot climates. And in a year that is after the Euros, where a lot of the core players for both of these clubs had difficult seasons, Leverkusen can sit back and relax in the summer and really think this through. And that's a luxury, I think, that if they use right and Wirtz and Alonso stay, next year can be a huge year for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was actually one of the points I made to a lot of the people who are pushing back on my comments about Leverkusen. I was like, look, you might think Leverkusen have had a good season, but I'll tell you what, you will find out in the summer transfer window, because whether or not Alonso stays at that club, a huge chunk of those players will be sold, I think. And a lot of the big names that people probably wouldn't expect to be sold will definitely be sold.
Yeah.
I actually was listening to another podcast in midweek, and one of the people on it was who doesn't follow German football. They're asking someone who does, but saying, "Oh, do you think Alonso will stick around if they sell Frimpong?" As in, the idea that he'd want to keep his key players. I think he'll stick around. I think he'll only stick around if they sell Frimpong. Yeah. To be perfectly honest with you,
I think he wanted to sell Frimpong last summer.
Exactly. They've been trying to sell Frimpong for a couple of years now, and they can't get rid of him. Not to say he's not a good player; he's still a very key player for them. But they want rid of him, they want rid of Ta, they want rid of Boniface. There's a whole... I actually had Leverkusen's squad up in front of me there. I mean, you can go through that whole team. Like, in defence, Herdecki, I don't think he's good enough anymore. I know he's a key player as a captain, but I think he's kind of regressed to the average Bundesliga player that he is. And, Matej Kovar, the backup goalkeeper, who's had a couple of games this season, hasn't been good enough. No. That back line, Piero Hincapié, has been promising to become a top player for a number of years now. It's kind of dropped off. Tapsoba, another player who's been linked with a lot of moves. Jonathan Tah moved on. Billaquane and Hermoso, new signings we're waiting to see. That's the entire back line there, the centre backs. Grimaldo's dropped off. They need a backup replacement for him. Mukiele, he'll be sold. Arthur hardly played. Then you go into midfield. Granit Xhaka, probably now too old, needs replaced. Andrić, definitely too old, needs replaced. Palacios, always injured. Alex Garcia, okay, potentially a future. That's 1 out of 4. You go to the wingers. Frimpong, probably sold. Nathan Tella, okay, I think he's had a decent season. He's probably got a future at the club. Florian Wirtz, we just talked about. Buendia, probably return to Aston Villa. Jonas Hoffman, probably too old. Adley, good player, always injured. Martin Terrier, just signed, always injured. Boniface sold.
His Achilles. Terrier did his Achilles, and we all know what that means.
Yeah, and then just to finish up, Boniface probably sold. Patrick Schick, good player, always injured. So you go through that whole squad, and there's probably like 3 or 4 players there who I think should probably stay at the club next season. And that's just how wild it is. So yeah, it's going to be a very busy summer, I think, for Leverkusen.
It definitely will be. All right, let's touch on the last one here. Frankfurt. Big win for them over Heidenheim. Heidenheim, the situation looks really bad now. St. Pauli, the St. Pauli game was one that we featured in the previous show. They pick up 3 points against Kiel. 7 points clear now of Heidenheim with 5 games to go. That's, if you add the goal differential, an 8-point swing. I think St. Pauli can plan for the Bundesliga next year, Stefan. That's the good news coming out of this Heidenheim game if you're a St. Pauli fan. For Heidenheim, it's now going to get tricky. The European football really, really hurt them. And speaking of European football, Frankfurt, 5 points clear of 5th. And that is a huge, huge result for them. Their goal differential isn't quite as big to mine, so, it is really just the 5 points. But with 5 games to go, you would think that Frankfurt will probably wrap up that top 4 finish. Big match for them on Thursday. And the way that they played today against Heidenheim, I think, was a really great audition for that second leg against Tottenham. Shaky against Tottenham, I have to admit, in that first leg. Tottenham hit the crossbar a couple times, right? And they really hung on to it. But you're going home with a draw in London. I fancy Frankfurt to go through there. So this could be a massive week for the Eagles. And in a week that they look now they're going to return to Champions League football. I actually have a really big interview coming out with the sporting director Timo Hardung for Transfermarkt. It's 1,500 words, so that's coming out next week, where they kind of talk about the finances, decisions about selling players, buying players, etc., discovering the next Omar Mamouche, that sort of stuff, but also what Champions League football means for them as a club going forward. And the one thing that they stressed is that they've never qualified for the Champions League through the league. Of course, they won the Europa League. That's how they got in the last time, right? and how big of a deal that would be for them, because it would be the most honest way of qualifying for the Champions League. And I think this today was a big step for Eintracht Frankfurt.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a game I think they probably had to win, to be perfectly honest
Yeah.
with you. I know it's an easy thing to say after the match, but if you kind of look at their form recently, it has been quite inconsistent. They have been picking up points, of course, but that defeat to Werder Bremen last week felt like a kind of stuttering moment. You're like, oh goodness. And they do have a really tough run in. They play Augsburg, then Leipzig, who obviously a bit of a 6-pointer, if you will, for that top 4 finish. Mainz, St. Pauli, and Freiburg. So that's basically their last 5 Bundesliga games are all teams who all have something to play for and will be desperate, will be clawing for every single point. But yeah, I mean, Tottenham, I think, lost in the Premier League today, if I'm not mistaken. They're all over the place. So you would kind of fancy them to win that game. And their home form, for the most part, has been pretty solid. I know they obviously lost to Leverkusen at Union Berlin recently, but Union in particular seems to be kind of just ripping up tree trunks in their attempt to kind of stay up. So I would put it against Frankfurt there. But no, you're right. It has been a good season for Frankfurt. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about them, and people forget that they were still on track for one of the record points tallies in the Bundesliga. And as you said, the sports director is saying exactly that. Top 4 finish is not something that Frankfurt can take for granted at any point. They're a team who, very recently were really kind of struggling in mid-table, going from one manager to the next, and not that long ago, under Oliver Glasner, finishing 11th. So in his first season. So no, they deserve a huge amount of credit, Frankfurt, absolutely. And this will probably be a historic season for them in terms of the Bundesliga title. And I mean, I think they probably have been one of the few clubs that have been able to take advantage of a lot of those teams from like 3rd to like 10th, who've all kind of really struggled this season. Your Leipzigs, your Dortmunds, etc., etc. Yeah. It feels like Frankfurt have been able to kind of keep together some sort of semblance of consistency where these teams have all just kind of completely dropped the ball from one week to the next. But yeah, they'll deserve it. And hopefully with that Champions League football, they can continue building that squad, because they have been one of the most consistent and top performers in the transfer market in the Bundesliga recently. And I think I actually wrote a newsletter about this quite recently, actually, talking about how good they've been in the transfer window. So they thoroughly deserve it.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I point out in the story I did with Timo Hardung was that they're one of the most efficient teams in terms of the squad value that the team has and the amount of money they spend for it. They're one of the most efficient in German football. Like they spend very little money for quality players. I mean, Omar Mamouche is a great example, right? They've signed him on a free transfer and then sold him for 70 million euros. Kolo Muani, the same story. He signed on a free transfer, sold for 95 million euros. I mean, these kind of deals are mind-boggling, and they've really been able to do this over and over again. You look at some of the players in the current squad that are already being linked to some really big names, right? Larsson is the one that is now being linked to Man City, that they picked up for very little money from Malmö. Another name, Namandi Collins, they paid €1 million to Dortmund to pick him up from the 3rd team. And he's just been a phenomenal player for them. Oscar Højlund is another one. Uko Ikitike, okay, they paid €70 million for him to PSG, but we all know that they're going to sell him for probably close to €100 million when they finished with him. And that is just remarkable, because at the same time, they've been able to make the club better on the field every single year. And I think that is very impressive. And that's, they might be again in a semi-final of a European Cup competition by the time this week is over, while being in the top 3 in Europe. And I think if that all happens and they wrap that up in that way, I think that is maybe the emergence of a club that can really finally live up to its reputation. We all know what Frankfurt is as a city. But I also think, you mentioned the Tottenham result. They lose 4-2. For all our Bayern listeners listening to this, close your ears. Mathys Tel scored. Just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, there's a growing suggestion that they're actually going to try and sign him. So, there might be something in that for Bayern, a bit of a payday. But yeah, it'll be interesting what they do against Tottenham, because Tottenham are all over the place right now. But yeah, semi-final spot in the Europa League, as well as finish the top four, is undoubtedly a great season for Frankfurt. And in a season where a lot of top teams in Germany have kind of really dropped off, I think we can safely say that they've overperformed.
Absolutely, and I mean, yeah, it's been, I think, in my opinion, been some time coming, and I can't wait. That Thursday game in front of 50,000 hardcore fans at the Waldstadion. If you have not experienced a European night there and you're a Tottenham fan, you're in for quite a ride. It's going to be a great game, and hopefully with a good result for Frankfurt. So let's wait and see how it plays out. All right, Stefan, let's wrap it up. This is enough of us. People want to enjoy listening to someone else for a change, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Usual slate of podcasts and content coming to you this week. As always, doing the Champions League recaps, and then, of course, our respective newsletters and the preview show later this week. Also need to point out it's Easter weekend next week, so there's no Friday game. Because that's what the Germans call a quiet holiday, which means no fun for people, including football. So we will not have a Friday game to discuss, which is nice for Stefan and I. It means we have a little bit extra time. All right, and until next time then, auf Wiedersehen.